Europe in the 16th century saw a period of vigorous economic expansion. This expansion, in turn, played a major role in many other transformations, social, political, and cultural, of the early modern age of Europe. One of the major triggers for Spain's invasion of England was the difference in their religious beliefs and Elizabeth taking the throne of England in 1588. To understand the cause of this battle, we need to go back to the time of the reign of King Henry VIII and the English Reformation. King Henry VIII began the English Reformation as a political exercise over his desire to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Over time, England had become increasingly aligned with the Protestant Reformation taking place in Europe, especially during the reign of Henry's son, Edward VI. Edward died childless and his half-sister Mary ascended the throne in 1533. Mary and her husband, Philip II of Spain, began to reassert Roman Catholic influence over church affairs. Her attempts led to more than 260 people being burned at the stake, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary's death in 1588 led to her half-sister Elizabeth taking the throne. Unlike Mary, Elizabeth was firmly in the reformist camp and quickly re-implemented many of Edward's reforms. Philip, no longer co-monarch, deemed Elizabeth a heretic and illegitimate ruler of England. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, Henry had never officially divorced Catherine, making Elizabeth illegitimate ruler of England. It is alleged that Philip supported plots to have Elizabeth overthrown in the favor of her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. These plans were thwarted when Elizabeth had Mary imprisoned in 1567. Mary was forced to leave the crown of Scotland in the favor of her son, James VI. Elizabeth was forced to have Mary executed, finally, in 1587, due to the constant plots against Elizabeth carried out in Mary's name. Elizabeth also retaliated against Philip by supporting the Dutch revolt against Spain, as well as funding privateers to raid Spanish ships across the Atlantic. In retaliation, Philip planned an expedition to invade England in order to overthrow Elizabeth, and if the Armada was not entirely successful, at least negotiate freedom of worship for Catholics and financial compensation for the war in the Low Countries. Through this endeavor, English material support for the United Provinces, the part of Low Countries that had successfully succeeded from the Spanish rule, and English attacks on Spanish trade and settlements in the New World would end. Philip was supported by Pope Sixtus V, who treated the invasion as a crusade with the promise of a subsidy should the Armada make land. Substantial support for the invasion was also expected from English Catholics, including wealthy and influential aristocrats and traders.
So, what were the reasons for the Spanish Armada? Firstly, it's important to realize, as for many, it was the execution of Mary, the Queen of Scots, that caused the Armada to be launched as some form of revenge against England and Elizabeth. There are 4 reasons why Philip launched the Spanish Armada, and these are religion, politics, events, and reaction, and we'll be looking into these 4 individually. Firstly, religion. England was a Protestant country under Elizabeth, and Philip II, as a Catholic, wanted to restore Catholicism to England. He had the support of the Pope in his efforts, with the Pope even offering a reward for the successful restoration of Catholicism. In addition to this, Spain had worked on a number of plots to attempt to remove Elizabeth. Politics. Philip II wanted to increase his power significantly, so adding England to the Spanish Empire would be a great asset. As well as this, the French and Spanish had signed the Treaty of Joinville in 1584, which committed the French and Spanish to wiping out Protestantism in Europe. As a counter to this, Elizabeth and the Dutch had signed the Treaty of Nonsuch in 1585 to combat Spanish aggression. Lastly, the reactions. Spain had for a long time started building an empire in the New World with huge Spanish galleons sailing to and from Spain to the New World. This effort was often frustrated by Sir Francis Drake, who would have attacked and raided Spanish efforts. This ultimate insult came from the raid on Cadiz, where Drake had managed to destroy and damage significant proportions of the Spanish fleet.
With British supporting the rebels within the Spanish-controlled Netherlands and also attacking and raiding the ships of Spain sent to America, added on to the anger of Philip. That's when he decided in 1587 to form the Spanish Armada and take the revenge against England. Philip, along with the Pope Sixtus V's blessing, took this decision to bring back the folks to their heretical island. King Philip gathered more than 130 ships containing 8,000 soldiers and 18,000 sailors to be a part of the Spanish Armada. Even though all the ships were loaded with munitions, but they were still not enough to suffice due to the financial crisis caused due to the attacks by the English. On the 28th of May 1588, the Armada under the command of Duke of Medina set sail for the Netherlands, where it was to pick up additional troops for the invasion of England. As the Armada sailed through the English Channel, the English Navy, led by Charles Howard and Francis Drake, fought a battle of attrition with the Spain from Plymouth to Portland and then to the Solent, preventing them from securing any English harbors. While the Spanish were at their anchor, there is a crescent-shaped defensive formation. The English used fire ships to break the formation and scatter around the Spanish ships. In the subsequent Battle of Gravelines, the English Navy inflicted a defeat on the Armada and forced it to sail northwards in a more dangerous, stormy waters on the long way home. As they sailed around Scotland, the Armada suffered severe damage and loss of life from the stormy weather. As they approached the west coast of Ireland, more damaging stormy conditions forced the ship ashore while others were totally wrecked.
Failure of the Spanish Armada. Off the coast of Gravelines, France, Spain's so-called Invincible Armada is starting to get defeated by an English naval force under the command of Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake. After 5 days of constant cannon exchanges with Drake's ships, the Spanish were now running desperately short of ammunition. In addition, Medina Sidonia, a city in Spain, had extra complication, so they needed to pick up extra troops needed for invasion from somewhere in the mainland. On 27 July, the Spanish decided to anchor just off Gravelines near modern-day Calais to wait for the troops to arrive. The English were quick to exploit this vulnerable situation. Just after fighting for 8 hours straight, they released something known as hellburners. That is, old ships loaded with anything that would burn were set adrift into the resting and closely packed armada, with ships made of wood sporting canvas sails and loaded with gunpowder. Spanish couldn't help but recognize the devastation these fire ships could cause. Amidst much confusion, many cut their anchor cables and sailed out in the sea. But as they broke into the dark of the channel, their crescent-shaped, strong defensive formation had disappeared, and now they were vulnerable to the attack. The English took the opportunity, attacked, but they were bravely fought off by 4 Spanish galleons that were attempting to protect the rest of the fleeing armada. Outnumbered 10 to 1, 3 of the galleons ultimately perished with significant loss of life. The English fleet, however, had assumed that they had blocked any chance that armada could retreat back down to English Channel. So after the Spanish fleet had reassembled, it could head only in one direction, that's northwards to Scotland. From here, sailing past the west coast of Ireland, they could perhaps make it to home, Spain. Attempting to sail northwards and away from trouble, the more agile English ships caused considerable damage to the retreating armada. With insufficient supplies, together with the onset of the harsh autumnal British weather, the omens were not good for the Spanish. Freshwater food quickly disappeared as armada rounded the north of Scotland in mid-September. It sailed into one of the worst storms to hit that coast in years. Without anchor cables, the Spanish ships were unable to take shelter from storms, and as a consequence, many were dashed to the rocks with great loss of life. The ships that survived the storm headed to the Catholic island in order to resupply for the journey home to Spain. Taking shelter in now what called Armada Bay, just south of Galway, the starving Spanish sailors went ashore to experience the famous Irish hospitality, just to know they were attacked and killed. When the tattered Armada eventually returned to Spain, it had lost half of its ships and three-quarters of its men. Over 20,000 Spanish sailors and soldiers had been killed too.
War with the Spaniards continued to be fought after the Armada's defeat, and in 1589 it was England's turn to attempt an invasion and to be repelled by Spain. It was known as the Counter Armada or the Drake Norris Expedition. This expedition was under Sir Francis Drake in command of the ships and Sir John Norris in command of the troops. They were assigned several objectives, the first being to seek out and destroy the surviving ships of the 1588 Armada in the ports of northern Spain. The second was to make a landing at Lisbon, to raise a revolt there against Philip II, then King of Portugal as well as Spain. The English Armada was arguably misconceived and ended overall in failure. Many Spanish ships were captured, but when the English pressed their attack on the citadel, they were repulsed. Owing to poor organization and lack of coordination with the Portuguese, the invading force failed to take Lisbon. Sickness then struck the expedition, and finally a portion of the fleet led by Drake was scattered in a storm. In the end, Elizabeth sustained a severe loss to her treasury. The Spanish victory marked the revival of Philip II's naval power through the next decade. The new King of England, James I, was the Protestant son and successor to the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. James regarded himself as the peacemaker of Europe, and the ultimate aim of his idealistic foreign policy was the reunion of Christendom and to negotiate peace with King Philip of Spain. Now, how did this war actually end? It was through the Treaty of London. This treaty was signed in 1604 and it concluded the 19-year Anglo-Spanish War. The negotiations took place at Somerset House in London. The Anglo-Spanish War had been a complex and fluctuating conflict that also had connections with other wars. The war by 1600 had been going on for nearly 15 years with neither side taking advantage. The treaty, however, ended a war that was disastrous for Spain and marked the end of the age of Queen Elizabeth and the beginning of Anglo-Spanish cooperation.
The English also saw the defeat of the Armada as an act of divine providence. Henceforth, it was confirmed that the England was a kingdom that was destined for greatness.